Thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be able to share some of the things that I've been thinking about and some of the things that I think are important during this time. I can see already that we've got lots of people coming on. So wow, 140 people and counting. I guess I'll jump right in and talk a little bit about what I think is some of the things that I've been seeing, and also what I think is really important in relation to futures in, through, and beyond a time of crisis. Of course, I think the first thing is to thank not only Miguel and Fran and the entire team, but also I think a sense of gratitude to the people who are clearly on the front lines of this crisis. So the healthcare workers, the people doing essential services, people keeping foods in grocery stores, people trying to keep us secure during this time. And I think that's really critical. And I think for myself as a futurist, in thinking about my own work, it's really helpful to think about the variety of futures and how different voices and perspectives are critical to those imaginings. I think that in my own work, I've tried to bring that and make that an aspect that's critical. And I'm going to talk a lot about perspective and context in the next 15 minutes, and then would love to have time for conversation. So I am currently working as the director at the Kazakh Research Institute for Future Studies. We're a new organization, essentially looking to bring futures and foresight to Central Asia, but also beyond. So we've got a team that we're building there. We're offering courses for graduate and undergraduate students and really trying to develop this. And I mention this because part of what I want to talk about is my own journey as a practitioner and how that helps me think about some of these questions now. I spent a few years working with the Center for Post-Normal Policy and Future Studies. Really helped me dig into post-normal times theory, which I'll talk about today as well. And also I think it's really valuable to learn from different people that bring in the importance of culture and context for futures. And then of course, my main training was at the University of Hawaii at Manoa with Jim Dater at the Manoa School, which Manoa School then refers to a global group of people who have over different generations had the chance to learn and to take a variety of methods. Of course, the most famous is the Manoa School scenario modeling method, but also to bring a particular approach to future studies and foresight. And I think that for me was really critical because I wanted to have the chance to reflect and think about what a lot of the things that I was seeing. And of course, I was born and raised in the US. So I think one of the most important things now is to make sure that we pay particular attention to the way that we are approaching the crisis. And I think from my perspective, that meant to not talk about the crisis in the singular sense. Which is to say that we are dealing with a variety of forms of crises that are clearly complex, clearly interconnected, and we need better ways to think about the complexity, to approach that complexity, and to try to find better ways, I think, of helping people understand that. So I love this image because it's really, I think, hits the nail on the head of the variety of things that have come together. So the torrent of crises that we're facing is not just about the pandemic, obviously misinformation, disinformation, political governance, leadership crises, and bringing all of those things together. And I think for me, that's precisely the value of foresight, is to help us think about complex phenomena, to help us to spot emerging issues, to model potential impacts, and to think through some of those possibilities. Now, I also like to bring certain framings, and this is a quote that I use a lot when I'm talking about the work that I do. It's also how I sort of explain to my father what it is I do for a living. He was an accountant for 40 years and thinks it's kind of crazy that you can talk to people about the future for a living. I really like this by Michel Foucault. It's attributed to him, although finding an exact citation is often been difficult. I love that he mentions this idea that fundamentally it's about trying to put windows where there are walls, and to try to find new ways of seeing things. Of course, from an architectural perspective, walls, especially load-bearing walls, are quite critical. So you have to be careful in where exactly you put a window. And windows are not just about seeing things and looking out, but also about letting in light. So it is about how we see both internal and external in new and different ways. And I think from my perspective, all of those experiences, all of those framings were really quite critical for me in how I was seeing not just futurists, but more broadly people talk about their current situation. And of course, it's been absolutely unescapable. The black swan has been thrown around, used and abused quite dramatically. So we're seeing it, of course, in places like the Wall Street Journal, We're seeing a variety of organizations, put it out front and center in their analysis: Harvard, MIT, Arizona State. And things are out of hand when the folks at Supply Chain Management Review and the Sarasota Herald Tribune start talking about the black swan. So I think, if anything, we've simply reached peak black swan. And from my perspective, that's actually great, because that allows us to take stock and to reflect. Why is it at this moment that we felt necessary to say this is or this is not a black swan? Why is it at this moment that there was this implicit gesturing towards, yes, Futures and Foresight saw this coming. Yes, we told you so. It's not to say that that's not true, but I don't think fundamentally that that's the conversation that we want to be having. I think there are a variety of forms and different examples of people clearly spotting this potentiality, of talking about the complexity of this current situation, and alluding to the threat and the risk that was there. But I think if we find ourselves having that particular conversation, I don't think we're doing a service to exactly what it is that we want to do, and I'll talk more about that as I go forward. Of course, even the sort of the champion of this particular metaphor or concept, even Taleb hasn't refrained. He said, look, this is not a black swan. He's irritated. We've had black swans, and he mentions, of course, the September 11th attacks. I thought that was actually quite interesting, because if we look back, it's not clear actually that the September 11th attacks actually meet his own criteria for a black swan. So I think this, to me, highlights one of the critical challenges of this particular conceptual framing. And I turn specifically then to a fantastic book by Peter Schwartz called Inevitable Surprises. And he mentioned specifically the work that he did as part of a sort of a legislative group that was commissioned to look into possible threats and risks, created scenarios. One of those scenarios actually had what invariably ended up being the attack. So there's, I think, a little bit of tension here. And I think we want to make sure that we're creating the right kind of way of talking and thinking about possibilities for the future. I also think one of the challenges here is not to get stuck in the diagnosis, but to continuously focus on prognosis. So of course, the same can be said for the 2008 financial crisis. And so I think in my own thinking, I've tried to return to something that was common as a phrase in the Department of Political Science at the University of Hawaii, which was championed by a professor there, Mike Shapiro. And a number of us in the Manoa School also had classes with him. And he talks a lot about the conditions of possibility. This is essentially a Kantian philosophical concept that is all about sense, is about awareness, is about perception. And I think now more than ever, that's quite critical in the work that we do as futurists. Of course, there have been a variety of really amazing reflections done. I really like a piece by Arundhati Roy that was published in the Financial Times. And I think she mentioned something that's quite critical. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Of course, that might feel really far away now, but as we know, we've got really extraordinarily flexible systems that love to snap back. So as we saw with the last 2008 financial crisis, it's been an accelerant to a kind of normalcy that has actually been obviously contributing to the problem. So in my own work, I'm trying to refrain from this idea of the new normal. Clearly, there's a lot of politicizing. There are implications to this that I think stretch beyond sort of foresight work, the degree to which we implement this sort of normalcy and what that actually means. And of course, I'm completely biased in this regard. So having worked on post-normal times theory, having brought that to the fore in my own work, I think now more than ever, it's critical to hold that in-between space. And I mention that because I think this is really the classical definition of post-normal times, and where I think it actually adds a lot of value is focusing on that in-between and holding it as a real possibility space and allowing that uncertainty to be something that is malleable, is something that we can actually draw value from, and to allow that such that we don't sort of fall back or the system is not snap back, but we actually have the potentiality to create substantive and substantial change. And so as part of the work with post-normal times theory, there isn't just the black swan concept. There's also the black elephant, which comes from Vinay Gupta. And also then we created the idea of the black jellyfish. These were essentially refined and put into a paper called The Three Tomorrows, which is an actual scenario modeling and futures method. And I think most importantly is that these are seen as an ensemble, which is to say that they're meant to be collectively utilized and they're not meant to be sort of split apart. So I think one of the biggest challenges in saying this is or is not a black swan is, again, that's not the point. The point is, of course, it's a black swan for some people. Of course, it's not for others. So how do we draw value from the exact sort of space in between those? And how do we feel okay as futurists with continuously holding that space of complexity, that space of diversity and perspective and context? And I think now more than ever, it is around trying to find ways to illuminate the contradictions, to enliven these novel considerations, and to really challenge these deeply held convictions. So Wendy Schultz, who's a phenomenal futurist, also went to the Hawaii program, was quite critical in getting these concepts or these metaphors into question form. And I think, again, it's not about one or each of these having singular power, but as an ensemble, as a collective, how do these help us understand and think through the assumptions, the biases that we have, the needs, the wants, the desires, and bring more criticality to the kinds of ways that we are making sense of the future. So for me, it's about going back to the core of futures work, which is sort of what we see and how we see it. How can we find better and more critical and creative ways to do that? And also, I think a major influence of my own work has been the work of Ivana Milojevic and Sohail Inayatullah, and their work on narrative foresight. Why I think narrative foresight is aligned with post-normal times, but also where I think it adds value, is it's not on a particular future being true or false. It's about the story and the narrative aspects of how we make sense of the future, how those futures are available to us through narrative and story, or images of the future, and how we find through narrative and story ways of reimagining, but also expressing value and purpose, needs, wants, and desires. So the example that's used often in one of the seminal papers is a study that was done, and people were asked, okay, if you imagine that crime is a beast, what is your response? And of course, unsurprisingly, when people were told that crime is a beast, their response was fundamentally to build prisons and to have harsher prison sentences. But then the language was changed, the metaphor was changed, and people were said, okay, crime is a virus, what is your response now? And the response was completely different. The response was education. The response was actually to deal with the conditions of possibility, which things like inequality. So I think what this research really shows, and where I think it's quite useful, is that metaphors actually have a lot of influence how we view and how we see complex problems, and they actually allow us to think differently about the options and the possibilities that we have. It changes decision making. Of course, I think that one of the critical things that we're seeing emerge now, the dominant narrative and sort of how that is connecting present to future, is around war. So it's war on the virus. Of course, it's World War V. We're seeing lots of groups talk about this possibility. I was watching PBS not that long ago, and Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary in the US, president of Harvard, was talking, and he said, look, we're at war with this. He talks about casualties. He talks about strategies to win. And what I think is dangerous in that particular framing is that enlivens a certain sensibility for people. Aside from I think the very real ethical and political considerations and ramifications for what this means, and Arundhati Roy mentions this, of course people are going to use war metaphor if war is already on their mind. So how do we shift that metaphor precisely so we can enliven new possibilities? So I went back to my roots, and part of my roots at the University of Hawaii at Manoa was reading and thinking about the work of Jim Dator, one of the founders of Future Studies. And he has some fantastic work and has for a number of decades used the metaphor of tsunamis of change. And why I think tsunamis of change are certainly a much more powerful, a much more rich metaphor, a metaphor that enlivens a greater set of conditions of possibility, is that it allows us to rethink the nature and purpose of the work that we're doing, which is precisely to allow people to understand that the future cannot be predicted, that we don't have complete control over any kind of operational environment, that just like a tsunami, these events happen. Our aim is to be able to create better decisions, to create more preparations such that we can hopefully get better at surfing them. And surfing is also, I think, then part of that criticality of the metaphor. Certainly, I was never very good as a surfer in the 9 years that I spent in Hawaii. But I think what it teaches you is the limits of those kind of command and control responses. it is not that sort of, very kind of, standard talk that gets thrown around about agility, about anticipation. But I think it's about actually putting that into practice and giving some greater meaning to what that looks like. I also wanted to draw attention to some fantastic thinking that's being done now by a good colleague and friend, Richard Sanford, who says that, maybe actually it's a time to rethink the kinds of approaches that we have across the broader futures field, and to imagine, how people might value futures differently and value different kinds of futures. And I think he draws specific attention to the ways in which we're thinking about uncertainty, but how this enlivens different possibilities for what might lie ahead. And of course, I think the biggest thing for us is of course, we all know, right? The climate change emergency, the climate crisis has not dissuaded in any way. We're seeing certainly some reprieve in relation to things like air pollution, but ultimately it's a stark reminder that these tsunamis are continuing to come, and they will continue to come. And some of them are certainly an artifact of human creation, but some of them are just by the nature of reality itself. So how do we find better ways at anticipating, at preparing, but also at realizing the inherent uncertainty of the situation that we find ourselves in? I wanted to then close by returning to Foucault. So as I mentioned, that quote initially is attributed to him, but finding a direct citation, and my French isn't very good to be able to find it, the original has been quite difficult. This quote, the provenance is much stronger. So he mentions that in the struggle of humanity, nothing important has ever passed through windows, but has come actually through the triumphant collapse of walls. And again, as an American, I'm quite attentive now to the power of the wall as a metaphor and the collapsing of walls and what that really means. And clearly we live in a world now where walls are being put up in a variety of forms of ways. And we see that the virus has no regard for that whatsoever. So how do we find better ways of collapsing walls? I wanted to mention as well that some people have thought to maybe lay this at the feet of the foresight community. So this is a comment that was made online just a few days ago. And I think, and again, I'm preparing a response for this, but I think it is a mistake to talk about the ways in which that our work compels people. The aim is to attempt to have people reflect and to have people see potentialities, but clearly we need to find better ways of connecting, but also we need to recognize the crisis of leadership and governance that has really taken hold. So this is something I think that we'll continue to struggle with, but I think now more than ever, it's actually getting away from the singularity of certain conceptual framings and having greater diversity within that. So how I brought this back to my own work is through a few questions that I'm trying to reflect on now. How can I further presence, perspective, and context within my work? How does my work not just add windows, but collapse walls? And then finally, what possibilities become present to us on a collective, and global scale if we start to shift the metaphor from war to surfs up? And so these are some of the things that I've been thinking about. I would love to have the chance to talk and have a conversation about what you're seeing as well. Thank you again to Miguel, Fran. Oh, I see some friends are on. I see Miko is on. Sherman is on. Great, great, awesome. Yeah, so, okay, let's start. There were some questions that maybe I lost because maybe they were on and then they came back, but we'll jump in with these and then please, of course, if anyone has any questions, yeah, please. Okay, so someone says they're not a fan of Arundhati Roy. That's right, totally great, of course. So some kind of normalcy has to come back. So I think you're hitting on a really critical point. The normalcy that will come back is precisely the normalcy that we had before, not in the sense it will be the same, but that it's a manufactured normalcy. So I'm not saying that there won't be a normalcy or people won't feel normal or that normalcy won't actually have value. But one of the ideas of post-normal times theory that's been put together, which draws on the work of a thinker, Venkatesh Rao, is this idea of the manufactured normalcy field. Even in times of crisis, and by crisis, I mean not just what we're dealing with now, but even in frontline war situations. And I had the chance to work for the world's largest humanitarian organization for a little while. I was the Futures and Foresight coordinator at the International Federation Red Cross Red Crescent Societies. And what we saw continuously is that people find a way to have sort of life, right? There's a normalcy that can sort of happen. So I think fundamentally that the challenge for us is to precisely hold into some kind of suspension that need and that grasping back to the normal. Because I think that what the alternative allows us to do is to find better ways to reflect on actual collapsing these walls and possibilities to have something that's quite different. So I'm a little bit suspect of shifting back into this whole idea of a new normal or speaking about the new normals. I think it's far too premature given the uncertainty of what's happening now. But I also think it does a disservice to the kind of criticality and the kinds of complexity that we need to engage with at this particular moment. So, you know, for example, we talk about the new normal of digital, and that's all fine and dandy. But when we start to see further issues with particular platforms around, you know, privacy, or the challenges, let's say, if we begin to see, let's say, you know, cyber attacks or other issues, you know, again, it's easy for us to kind of find and to want to grasp onto those things. I think the greater challenge is to continuously hold that space of the post-normal. There's another question here by Tico. Have you thought of any other metaphor that could be suitable to deal with the situation better than war? Yeah, again, like I really, of course, like I'm partial to the surfing tsunamis, the surf's up metaphor. I think that what is really critical is we look around us and see, because there are a variety of cultures, contexts, even, you know, different perspectives to think about what this might look like. The best metaphors are the ones that really emerge from, you know, the culture and the context around us. And my sense is that all cultures have something to, and all contexts have something to contribute to this. So I think more than ever now, it's about trying to find a better way to have a sense of you know, creative and critical reflectiveness. I see Laurent is on. Hi, Laurent. He talks about the metaphor of surfing tsunami having a sense of powerlessness. I actually, I mean, I think the opposite, and I'm happy to disagree with Laurent, who's a good friend and colleague. I think actually that surfing tsunamis provides precisely the kind of agency that we need to have in the moment. And that agency is around, we don't have complete control over everything. We have to get better and move away from kind of this command and control mentality to more of the idea of navigating the uncertainties. So, you know, we know that fundamentally that we simply don't have the capacity to control everything in our operational environment. I mean, we use that as a term, and that's a term that gets used, right, in a lot of security, military defense, you know, circles. But ultimately, I think that the whole idea is that and this is, I think, a great reminder of this, we have to find better ways of realizing the constraints of our own agency. But I think more than ever, it is about, and certainly if you're out in the middle of the water and you're watching the waves come at you, you get better at sensing and being attentive to the kinds of flows that happen. Of course, I'm not, just to make sure everyone's clear, right? This is strictly metaphoric. I'm not, you know, suggesting anyone actually go out and try to surf tsunamis. People in Hawaii attempt to do that occasionally when these things happen. But fundamentally, it is a way for organizations to reframe and think about different possibilities. Again, I think that my concern is the limits of war as a metaphor or the particular ethical and political ramifications of that, I think become quite challenging. So Miko is asking a question, right? You know, where do you start with surfing tsunamis? Tips on approaches, tools, mental frames. Yeah, I think now more than ever that there's a real chance to position a new kind of conversation around how we think about the future. And I really like and appreciate the thinking that Richard is doing. How do we reposition value and make sure that value is critical to the kinds of futures that we're imagining? And again, value in the speculative sense of realizing that what we value might be different, how we value the future might be different. And of course, the values of people in the futures themselves, are, you know, ourselves included, could be quite different as well. So I think fundamentally then, you know, for me, it's about trying to always open up and keep that space available. So for me, any approach that continuously finds a way to have it be focused on a possibility, have it be focused on, you know, the potentiality of trying to realize the limits of the, you know, command and control perspective is quite critical and essential. It's not to say that I think core methods and approaches can't have value now, But I think now more than ever, we have to find a better way and be attentive and reflective in our practice. So, one of the things that is often quite difficult for, as a consultant, as a practitioner, as a researcher, certainly you do this as an academic, is you show your homework, right? You show your arguments, you really lay out sort of the frame that you're bringing to this. And if you notice, there's been lots of scenarios that have been thrown around out there, but not a lot of them talk about how and the why I would use this approach. What is the value of this? So I think now it's a real chance for us to reflect as a broader community. Okay, if we're choosing to use a particular approach, a particular way of doing something, let's talk about why. Let's talk about the limits of that. Let's not just focus on the content, but focus on the form. And I think to bring that sort of together, I think is quite critical. Mike has a question. What advice would you give to futurists at the beginning of their career? Well, Mike, I hopefully see myself at the beginning of a career as well. So I'm trying to live it and put it into practice myself, which is to say that there's an amazing community of people. And I think this event is also a realization of that, who are willing to connect and willing to share. And so I have benefited tremendously from the generosity of the extraordinary global futures and foresight community. Of course, I've been very fortunate to be able to work directly with a lot of people and to be able to study with some amazing people. But I will say that there's a really fantastic and amazing group, whether we're talking about World Future Society, Association of Professional Futurists. World Future Society has also come in recent years to really try to reemerge and position itself. And I think there are ways of engaging with that community, and I think people do make themselves available. So I've had great relationships that have been born of these organizations, or even Twitter, right? Just by connecting with people there. So I think that as a futurist starting out, I think it's an extraordinary time to be able to do this kind of work. And I think now more than ever, it is about trying to find ways of collaborating and connecting with people. Marta has a question. Do you think this crisis will end with new ways of doing things, or will come back to old ways? I think the answer is yes and yes, which is to say that, of course, I think people will want to try to find ways of actually going back to and regaining that sense of kind of normalcy. But I also think that there is an opportunity, and there will always be an opportunity, to reimagine and enliven new possibilities for the future. I mean, if we look at just, right, this event in and of itself, of course, these kinds of things happened previously, but there's a new sense of awareness and a new sense of the value and what these bring, given what's happening now. So I think the answer is always that both and I realize that might be unsatisfying. The challenge for us, I think, is about to try to find ways to actually have people create that sense of agency. And I think back to Laurent's point, realizing the limits of what we can control, the limits of what we're able to put forward in the sense of shaping the future. Obviously, we can't create the future perfectly. So I think that it becomes about trying to find the right kinds of points of engagement, choosing the right kinds of opportunities and trying to put those into practice. I think is something that we're all going to have to pay attention to sort of as we go forward. So for a number of years, to sort of hang myself out to dry, I've said I'm really serious about climate change. I really think it's a problem, and yet I continue flying all over the world talking to people about the future. So for me, it's been a really it's been a spear in the chest moment. It's been a real gut check. I can do this work and limit the travel that I have. And I think that's something in particular that I want to pay further attention to. So of course, I think there will be structural and systemic shifts that will happen. But I think for myself as a practitioner, now it's going to be something that I'm going to be more direct and bring up with different clients, and feel like I could actually put that as sort of something that's quite critical and quite essential. Okay, David has a question. How might we spread the word about foresight in our organizations and teams? Now is a fantastic time to run that up the flagpole. So I think quite critically, the opportunity is that we have to essentially create some shared sense of purpose and understanding about the value that these methods, tools, and approaches can bring. I think most importantly, the worst thing we can do is to say, okay, this worked here, let me sort of take it and plug it in there. I think actually that there has to be localization, contextualization to all of these tools and methods and approaches, I certainly don't think, that one has to, go off and get a PhD in this to be able to, to do this and to do this well. I think that there are a variety of ways of connecting with different forms of futures and foresight. And there's always low-hanging fruit that, can be brought to the fore in decision-making through these kinds of processes, but to show value and to really try to find a way to enhance conversations. I know that in the last few years, I've spent a lot of time trying to get organizations to focus on learning and unlearning. And I'm sure that's something we'll hear about in the next few days. So I think how foresight and futures work can be positioned to contribute to organizational learning. Of course, a lot of futures and foresight work is about the external environment, right? What the quote actual future will be, even though again, the actual future doesn't exist. Different possibilities are always there. But how do we get better at sort of blending the actual and the perceptual in the framings that we bring? So I think now more than ever, it's about when we bring this to our organizations, when we're socializing the very idea of foresight, that we find sort of, some great examples out there, but the conversation always comes back to how do we own this? How do we make this part of our DNA as an organization? And how do we find ways of localizing and contextualizing such that we can actually get value for this in what we're thinking about and what we want to do as an organization? Anita has a question and brings up Socrates. Yay, my first degree was in history of ideas and philosophy. There's a phenomenal amount of work being done now specifically around education. And I've had the opportunity to work with different organizations in my work with the UN over the years. I've had a chance to obviously collaborate with groups like UNICEF. And I think that you'll hear actually a little bit about this in the next few days. So Peter Bishop has a phenomenal initiative that he's been leading the last few years called Teach the Future. And I think people are specifically looking to ingrain and instill more futures and foresight work, which has been done for obviously a number of decades at a variety of different educational levels, but to really try to bring it more towards the primary space. And I think that's something that is being done. Okay, question from Amin. Thank you for the insight. Words like challenge for us and we, who does it encompass? Individuals, decision makers, specific coalitions. Yeah, and I think like this is really quite critical. So anytime we use an us or a we have to really be clear about what that means. I think at the end I mentioned kind of like us or we collective. I really mean at the level kind of in the sense of thinking about sort of humanity as a species. I think a number of people will talk about the idea that foresight could be this evolutionary capacity. I know this is something that Frank Spencer is fond of talking about, the transformational opportunities there. I often don't invoke, evolution as a metaphor. I'm more partial to, let's say, the idea of mutation, which can be a bit more random, I suppose, but intimately connected. But I think fundamentally that it is about how do we find better ways to talk about these things. Again, I think actually that, I see the point that, of course, we need to talk the talk and walk the walk, and as you say, walk the talk. But if we don't have the right kind of language in place, it won't ever allow us to actually put the right kinds of things into practice. So that's why my own particular practice at this point, my own reflection, has been thinking about the kind of language, the kind of framings, the kind of conversations. Because I think in a variety of contexts, we see the power of language and the power of organizations or certain ideologies to sway language and therefore sway awareness. And I think that now more than ever is why I want to pay attention to that. I think initially I was thinking, okay, who should we target? And the truth is anyone and everyone who could possibly listen. I mentioned that briefly, that there is a crisis of leadership and a crisis of governance, and I believe that to be true. So some saying, okay, now's the time for bloody revolution, and of course there may be contexts where that's going to happen. But fundamentally, we also have to realize that at the end of the day, this could be an opportune space where actually there is the possibility of creating shifts at a governance level. So already we've seen some fascinating initiatives, right? Spain's going to try to roll out universal basic income. Amsterdam is going to look at donut economics. Clearly, lots of governments are realizing, oh, wait a second, business as usual wasn't just working. Business as usual was the problem. How do we find better ways of doing that? Okay, Jose is asking about Kazakhstan. Has it been hit? Yeah, so actually I got on one of the last flights out of Kazakhstan. My wife's family is from Belarus, so I'm riding the storm in Belarus. And if you've been watching the news lately, Belarus has sort of been in the news for all the wrong reasons. There haven't been a lot of strong control measures here. Social distancing has been, or physical distancing, excuse me, has been sort of recommended. And in the grocery store, there are little lines, but sort of business as usual here. Kazakhstan seems to be doing really well, very strong control measures. I'm hoping to get back to Almaty in the next few weeks. But actually, it's been quite, quite spared, at least in that sense. Of course, their cases continue to grow there, but it's still something that I think is still, hopefully being mitigated quite well. Okay, Marguerite has a question. In terms of post-normal times theory, do I see correlations between this theory and the anthropological concept of liminality in between states, often described in relation to rites of passage? Yeah, I think there's so many resonances with post-normal times theory, and to talk a little bit more about that, and I'm sure Jordi, Sarah, who's going to talk in the next day or so about post-normal times policy, will mention this as well. Post-normal times theory was born of a few things. Of course, it was born of post-normal science, which is a fantastic movement looking to have more democratic, more participation within scientific processes, specifically science policy linkages. But also, post-normal times theory was very much born out of the critical turn that we saw happen in humanities and social science and literary, critical theory over the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years. And so I think it does draw on these concepts like liminality. Certainly, I think Foucault has another great concept, the idea of the heterotopia, the space that's sort of held in between, where specifically things are kind of left in a different sort of operational way. So he mentions that kind of out at sea we have kind of in international waters, right? Some rules don't necessarily apply. And I think that's the kind of possibility space that as futurists we want to hold open. And it's precisely, I think, the value of our current moment. And people, some have said we shouldn't waste a crisis. I'm not sure I'm particularly fond of that, but framing. But I like the idea that what is happening now, and I think Richard Sanford mentions this, is it's looking and challenging us to think about the kinds of rituals and rites that are really important to us. So if anything now, the liminality is not just conceptual. I mean, we're actually feeling it. And how do we then find a way to bring that back to actually creating more criticality and hopefully having, again, not this sense of powerlessness, but realizing that society is a social invention. This is something that Jim Dator has said from the very outset of his work, and that we have the opportunity to be social inventors. So how do we get better at realizing the capacity to actually form and to take advantage of that? And again, realizing we can't obviously control everything, but everything that we have in society didn't exist at one time. Everything has fundamentally been created, has been shaped. So how do we get better at shaping that so that it is more egalitarian, is more equitable, is more ultimately sustainable? Question from Dennis. Hey Dennis, how's it going? So Dennis is a great colleague based in Korea. He talks about the current pandemic is related to climate change. Interestingly, I'd say that, of course, a number of arguments have been made around sort of encroachment upon, particular ecosystems. And of course, there's a concern about, okay, was that a contributing factor? I will say on the one hand, now I think everything relates to climate change. So it's impossible not to think about the future in any meaningful way without making some relation to climate change. But I think around the specific conditions of possibility for this particular event, it is quite interesting to imagine how climate change could have been either an accelerant or a particular driving force in this particular issue. I think actually even more importantly, that a number of scientists and analysts have been telling us for a long time, and futurists have been working on this for decades, that what climate change is going to do fundamentally is going to allow tropical diseases to move further up and down. So we will start to see, and we've seen in past years, whether it's concerns about things like Ebola or the Zika virus or H1N1, but that it will actually act as an accelerant, as a threat or a force multiplier, and it's something that we have to fundamentally consider as we go on. So I think it's something that not just is about collapsing possibilities for the future, but again, is about enlivening an awareness for us to engage with the complexities of climate change and what that means, yeah? And I think that's really quite critical for us. All right, I'm going to jump down because I know people kind of been going. Let's see. Oh, there's my colleague Elena. Hi, Elena. Futurists have been talking about the possibility of 9/11, about COVID-19, and then these things sort of happen. So why do governments pay so little attention to this academic field? Will this situation change after the present crisis? I would love nothing more than to sit here and to assure everyone that now things will fundamentally be different. I would love to sit here and feel completely confident in saying to you all that this is it. The governments around the world have finally woken up, and this is the moment, guys. Everything's going to really change from this point forward. I wish, however, while I wish, however, that would be true, I think we all realize that regardless of the threats and the risks that have been thrown at us collectively as a species, even over the last decade or 2 decades, that what we have seen is that actually there are a variety of responses. And unfortunately, I think that at the heart of the crisis of governance and leadership that we've seen is that it's actually compelled people, I think, to go against Neil's point, compelled people to revert back. And I think fundamentally, this is what we see. So the crisis that we have and are confronting is one that was identified by the famous futurist Fred Pollock in his work around the image of the future. The crisis we have now is of nostalgia, of a particular mindset, of a particular longing for a past where potentially things were quote, more normal, although again, that normal was always manufactured. But that fundamentally, that's the real challenge. And if you ask me honestly, do I think that we'll be able to convince Donald Trump in any meaningful way, let's say to use him as an example of leadership that could be open to change? The answer is unequivocally no. So I think that what that means is then we have to find creative ways for thinking about alternative possibilities, and a lot of work has been done on different opportunities for governance. So again, this goes back to the point around sort of the limits of agency and what we could possibly do. But clearly there are other decision makers who are open to this. So I love the messages that's been coming out of New Zealand. I think Taiwan has been doing a fantastic job and been quite transparent. And again, I think what we're going to start to see are different communities find different ways of reacting and responding, but also hopefully anticipating and being more proactive in the kinds of questions and concerns that we have around governance. Question or a point by Emily. Hi, Emily. Really great to see Emily. She's doing fantastic work out in the Pacific. Emily talking about localization of foresight with limiting travel. Countries are locked down, but lead sort of futures thinking. How can we engage and strengthen capacity through new online ways? I will say this, I worked last year as part of a global team, actually called the Global Foresight, Action Foresight Global Swarm. And we did a scan for cases of participatory futures. There's a phenomenal report. I'll include a link somewhere when I send my materials as published, and the work was supported by Nesta. And what we found was amazing examples of people doing participatory, engaging work using in-person, but also online means. So I actually think that there are really great examples of things that we can look at, adapt, localize, put into practice for how to connect with people. So one project that I was involved in, and I'll just mention this briefly, at the International Red Cross Red Crescent was, we had a big challenge. So it was 190 member nations, national societies. How do you talk to people for your strategy development process? Well, through a partner, through Newcastle University and their Open Lab, we were able to create a game that was played entirely on WhatsApp. And that meant that people from 120 countries and about 4,000 volunteers were able to provide insights as part of that lead up to the strategy development process. And I think that was really great because that was a way to engage and a new capacity the organization didn't have. So for me, that the kind of learning there is twofold. Is there are always partners who are willing to help to provide that kind of support. But it does mean that we actually need to break down some of the borders and boundaries at an organizational level. And what in our organization at the time, what that meant was IT department was freaked out. They were like, how do you do this in a way that's safe, right? And because it was framed as a game and as innovation, there was a little more flexibility. Of course, there were concerns around sort of like, keeping the data safe and everything else. But I think fundamentally that the impact that had on people's awareness and sense for the future within the organization was worth dealing and mitigating some of those challenges. So I think now more than ever, teams are looking at this, and there are some great examples, and I'll certainly be happy to share some of that. I'm going to randomly go, oh, hey, there's Luce. Hi, Luce. How are you? So she's talking about the public dialogue being sort of two choices, going back or it's all new, economy versus public health. Could that be a false choice fostered by limited imagination? Yeah, I agree 100%. I think now we're seeing all of these contradictions, right, sort of rise to the fore. And as we know about contradictions, right, we can beat our heads against the wall like this, or we can try to transcend them. And that's why I think actually having the right kinds of narrative and conceptual framings is really quite critical. So I think it's a lot of times, and I'm finding myself doing this now in conversations, is turning questions around. So precisely when the question becomes about a choice between public health and the economy, it's about saying, wait a second, why don't we have economic systems that put health and well-being at the forefront, right? And I think clearly we're seeing that come to a head now. So I couldn't agree more with you that actually that the crisis that we have is also about imagination, and a lot of people have been doing work on this for a long time. There's been some great work done by Alfonso Montori, Stuart Candy's also a colleague doing a lot of work in this area. So I think now more than ever, yeah, we do need better forms of imagination that are driven by the kinds of values that I think are important now. And Zia mentions this in his work on post-normal times, talking about humility, accountability, and responsibility. And I think that really, for me, is really ringing true. And so I've gone back to a lot of that early work and that essential work, because I think it's quite critical. Wow, I'm totally gonna random question here. I'll come all the way to the bottom. Who's the last person? Ask a question here. Okay, so Antonio is saying, okay, some future business gaps for startups and entrepreneurs after COVID-19. So I've actually just recently I just realized I'll be shifting out of the business school at my university and going to the School of Society, Technology, and Ecology. But I've been thinking a lot about, and people have been asking, right, where are clearly the opportunities for businesses and organizations and startups and entrepreneurs? And clearly we're gonna see a lot of interest in health and wellness. I think that obviously, aside from physical well-being, a lot of emotional, mental well-being is something that's going to be quite critical. People are clearly going to want to engage in others, and now that we have a new sense of awareness of the limits, but also the really amazing strengths of our digital environs, how do we get better at making sure those are more equitable? Right? Half the world has never even been on the internet. We have 70 million forcibly displaced people in the world. So how do we make sure that whatever we're doing, that it has this kind of for good aspect to it? And I think now more than ever, businesses, entrepreneurs are really going to have to speak to that. So I think that window of possibility and the conditions of possibility have clearly shifted, where business clearly will have a chance to help and to meet and respond to some of those needs. And I think now more than ever, it's about trying to find ways of really trying to create a better sense and awareness for possibilities for what could lie ahead. Whew.